I'm Lily, and this is my story. One that almost tore my life apart. It's strange how things can spiral out of control. When you least expect it, and how someone you trust can suddenly become someone who feels like a complete stranger. It all started so innocently. Really. My husband James and I had been married for 8 years. We had a beautiful home, excellent careers, and the most lovable golden retriever, Max, who was like a child to us. However, like all relationships, ours faced a challenging period. We were still together, but emotionally we had drifted apart. James was working late hours, and I often felt neglected, unnoticed, like I was disappearing. In my husband James and I had been married for 8 years. We had a beautiful home, great careers, and the most lovable golden retriever, Max, who was like a child to us. But like all relationships, ours hit a rough patch. We were still together, but emotionally we had drifted apart. James was working late hours, and I often felt neglected, unnoticed, like I was disappearing in my own home. I didn't realize how vulnerable Joe was. I was until John came into the picture. David was my husband's best friend and a frequent guest at our house. He had been part of our lives for years. He and James played basketball together, and the three of us would often share dinners, discussing a wide range of topics from life to sports to work. However, as time progressed, David became known as John. I started to connect in a way that felt different. It wasn't intentional, at least not at first. We joked around and laughed a little too hard at each other's jokes, but not too slowly. I began to look forward to the moments when John would come over. Those innocent conversations between us started to become more personal. We would discuss our life frustrations. And before I knew it, I was sharing things with JN that I hadn't even mentioned to James. The attention David paid to my new hairstyle and the way I styled my clothes, things James had long since stopped noticing, flattered me. It felt beneficial to be seen again, to feel important, but I never thought it felt pleasing to be seen again, to feel important, but I never believed it would go beyond that. At least that's what I told myself. Then one evening things took a turn. It was a typical Friday night. James had to stay late at work again, and JN came over to help me with some repairs around the house. Max was excited as always, jumping around, wagging his tail, and barking happily at John's arrival. Everything seemed normal. But there was a different energy between John and me, and it was the way his hand brushed against mine when he handed me a tool. We laughed as we fixed a broken cabinet in the kitchen, but there was tension growing between us. It was subtle at first, but it was there. After the repairs were done, we sat on the couch with Max between us, watching some random show on TV. Air felt thick, like something was bound to happen, but neither of us was willing to make the first move, and then it happened. I don't even know how to explain it. One moment we were sitting there, and the next, JN reached over and placed his hand on mine. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was something else, something more. I should have pulled away. I should have gotten up and told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I let it happen. The feeling of his touch sent a shiver down my spine, and for a split second, I didn't care about the consequences. It was like my mind shut down, and all I could feel was the warmth of his hand on mine. Even though he was lying at our feet, Max made a slight movement but remained still, giving the impression that he was aware that something was wrong. This was despite the fact that he was lying perfectly still. The truth is, however, that James came to a complete stop and walked in, completely unaware of what he had just interrupted. The sound of the front door opening made my heart skip a beat. When he arrived, I was completely surprised by his presence. David quickly pulled his hand away from me because he was embarrassed. Guilt flushed my face, and shame shook me. Despite the brevity of the events, the tension was intense enough to pierce through with a knife. James said, Hey, I'm home," as he casually placed his keys on the table. There were no other events going on at that time. After we'd finished watching television, I blurted out my voice, which was a little too high-pitched given the context. "I apologize for any inconvenience." When John stood up, he looked as uncomfortable as I did and said, "Yeah, I was just about to leave." He did this to avoid James's gaze. When David left that night, I was filled with dread because I had no idea what would happen. When he looked at me, he conveyed to me that he was feeling the same emotions as I was, that this was far from over, and that was the moment I realized I was in too deep of a hole. I was afraid of what would happen next. At first glance, it appeared that James was either unaware of the awkwardness between us or was simply too exhausted to care about it. At the time, I thought we were safe. I assumed we were safe when he approached Max and started petting him. It's possible that James didn't notice anything or that this situation will pass and we won't have to talk about it again. Both of these options are possible. However, I was fully aware that this was not the case. There had been an irreversible change in John and my relationship, and it was impossible to reverse the change. Even though we hadn't crossed the physical boundary, we were already on the brink of an emotional breakdown by the time we reached it. I felt a sense of dread as I anticipated the next event. On the evening David was leaving, he had a look on his face that told me he was experiencing the same feelings as I was. This was far from finished. James, a decent husband, was distracted and tired, but he did not deserve what was happening behind his back. Despite the fact that James had not done anything wrong, he was a decent husband. Even though I tried to convince myself it was just a moment of weakness, I felt it was more. I realized I should have ignored him, but I didn't. The truth is that I enjoyed the attention, and realizing this only made me hate myself more. Every time I responded, I felt like I was taking a risk, yet I couldn't resist. John was always present. He would text me random questions like how I was doing or how Max was behaving. It wasn't overly flirtatious, but the subtext was clear. He had not forgotten that night either. One evening, the situation escalated when James extended an invitation to John for dinner. He said it had been a while since the three of us had spent time together, and I couldn't exactly argue without raising suspicions. So I put on a smile and pretended like everything. I was unable to concentrate on anything during the dinner because every time David looked at me, I had the impression that he could see right through me, and every time James smiled at me, I felt like the worst possible person. I found the dinner uncomfortable, at least for me. Whatever I tried, I couldn't focus. We headed straight to the living room after finishing our meal. James and David were both behaving in their usual manner, laughing and chatting about sports while exchanging stories about their jobs. After a brief moment of hesitation, I decided to sit next to David on the couch. I made certain that there was always a discernible gap between us. David approached the couch and sat down. Max, who had been following us around, also sat down. He'd been following us the whole time. James was cleaning up in the kitchen without knowing John and I were getting tense. Then, in a moment that I will never forget, Max jumped up onto the couch between John and me, just as on the previous night. I'll never forget that moment. He was completely unconcerned about the emotional storm brewing in the room, despite the fact that he was wagging his tail. John laughed as he reached over to pet him, and his hand briefly touched mine again. Despite the fact that I felt I had seen it before, I quickly moved away from him, my heart pounding. It was as if I'd had déjà vu. John and Max were surprised when I abruptly stood up. I couldn't do this any longer. We have decided that James will assist in the kitchen. My voice shook slightly while I spoke. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own guilt, and I knew I needed to get out of there because the walls were closing in. As a result, it was imperative that I leave that location. James quietly hummed to himself while drying the dishes in the kitchen. There I found him. He seemed to be fully immersed in his life, blissfully oblivious to the emotional chaos unfolding around him. He appeared to be thoroughly enjoying his life. David did not speak, instead simply nodding his head, his expression making it difficult to understand. He said nothing. A sense of guilt as heavy as a freight train overtook me during my brief observation of him. I felt incredibly guilty about what I had done. Everything in this situation, including this specific action, was wrong. I was wondering if it was okay to have a conversation with you. James asked my question in a barely audible tone, just above a whisper. James turned his attention to me and noticed the expression on my face. As he did this, the smile he had been wearing began to fade. Who or what is the cause of the problem? As I stood there staring into his anxious eyes, I realized there was no way I could react negatively to this. Despite my best efforts, I was unprepared for the possibility that the truth would ultimately lead to his death. I wasn't prepared to shatter both of our lives at that moment. My mind whirled as I debated whether to reveal the truth to him. My mind raced, and I paused for a moment. Is it prudent for me to risk permanently losing him by confessing everything? Even though I didn't lie about anything, I managed to smile for the camera. Because my job has been quite stressful, I have recently felt a slight sense of unease, which I believe is due to the fact that I am experiencing it. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? James said this at a time when he appeared to be feeling relaxed and relieved. While hugging me, he said, "I'm here for you." I was surprised to hear that. At that precise moment, I made the decision to terminate my relationship with JN. His embrace was like a lifeline, pulling me back from the brink, and it was at that exact moment that I made my decision. I could not sustain this dangerous situation, where I was risking everything for an unworthy cause. I was risking everything for something. On the other hand, fate appeared to have different plans for us. After that, I texted JN that we needed to have a conversation. I explained that we needed to discuss it. My intention was to make it clear that we needed to stop this. I wasn't going to jeopardize my marriage over a fleeting attraction, no matter how intense it was. I wasn't going to do that. Rather than suggesting a public location for the meeting, he inquired about the possibility of meeting at James's house when James was not present. He agreed to meet up but did not specify a public location. This was a decision that I made despite my better judgment. Max greeted David with the same enthusiasm that he always does, completely unaware of the tension that existed in the room. Max greeting David. This was consistent with the agreement that I provided. I wanted to have a serious conversation with John, so I led him into the living room, where we were both sitting at the time. I needed to establish boundaries. On the other hand, David had different sets of ideas. David's eyes fixed on mine as soon as we sat down, surprising me because I expected him to lean in even closer than he did. "Is a Lil? I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low and serious. "I can't stop doing that." Despite my racing heart, I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry. This is wrong, we can't do it." I adore James. I am aware that he stated that his hand was reaching out to me once more, but I am unable to control my emotions. I took my hand away and stood up to create some space between us. "This has to stop, we cannot keep doing it." John stood up, a look of frustration on his face. "I am confident that you, Lil, are also experiencing it." I was overcome with panic just before I could respond when I heard the sound of the front door being unlocked. It surprised me when James arrived home an hour later than expected. I had expected him to arrive sooner. Almost immediately after James entered the building, I heard Max barking excitedly in the hallway. My heart began to pound in my chest as soon as I became aware of the difficult situation we were in. It was impossible to explain this without conveying a negative connotation. David's eyes widened and froze upon hearing the shocking news. To my satisfaction, I recognized Max's excited barking. When James walked into the living room, his face lit up with excitement because he recognized me. This happened as soon as he entered the room. Nonetheless, he became aware of David's presence at that moment. James asked a cautious but pointed question about the situation at hand. I tried to say something, but nothing came out. I was unable to communicate. There are no occurrences. I realized there was no way to explain this without sounding like a betrayal from the start. Despite the fact that I knew there was no way to explain it, I felt overwhelmed by guilt. His facial expression changed instantly, and he looked from me to JN, then back to me several times. His expression was different than mine. He arched his brow, concentrating. The expression on his face indicated that he was both confused and suspicious of the situation. I wanted to see how Max was doing. At that moment, I came to the realization that no matter how hard I tried, I could not undo what I had already done. This was the moment I realized it. James looked between us. His eyes narrowed, making it abundantly clear that he did not believe the excuse. "Even though Lily is at home, why would you want to check on Max?" A silence fell over the room. John quickly raised his voice and said, "I was just leaving." As soon as he realized there was tension, he spoke with far too little emotion. "I wanted to see how Max was doing."